All right, we're rolling. Well, Dan Feiler, welcome to Knowledge and Practice. Thanks for being here.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. How are you doing, Kirk?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Fantastic.
It's such an honor to have you here talking about this stuff. I think it's really interesting. So we're talking today about a subject you've been researching and teaching for more than 10 years, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's decision biases in particular. Specifically, we're going to talk about your work with NBA teams in this area, which I think is fascinating, and what you learned from that experience that can translate to other corporate environments. Personally, I've found this area of social science intriguing ever since I read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
It's a tome.
It's
Good
a
for you.
tome.
You made it through?
Oh, is it a tome? Okay, yeah. I mean, I think of it as sort of a handbook for life.
Yeah.
How to make decisions, how to approach situations, how to interpret situations. I think about it all the time.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant, yeah.
And I think it's interesting that he's a psychologist that won the Nobel Prize in economics.
Yep.
Which shows, I think, the kind of the crossover of what you're doing too, because you're bringing psychology into the business field. So let's get into your work with the NBA, which is exciting. So what were you doing? How did it develop, and what were your objectives?
So I took this, there were basically certain questions that started to feel very important as someone who studies decision-making under uncertainty, how we think about forecasting or, like navigating a risk. And at the same time, we've got analytics blowing up, massive amounts of data availability, and we're able to rely on that for decision-making more and more. And so what I think is interesting for a lot of organizations is they've got all this data, and it feels like we should be able to rely on analytics for our decision-making, which should reduce the effect that human judgment might have on some of these things. And yet, a lot of times, the analytics all go ultimately to people sitting around a table making a decision informed by that. And B, there now become questions of when are the data misrepresentative? What is it that the analytics are able to measure and act on, capture readily, and what are things that analytics and data can still get fooled by? And so all of a sudden I felt like there are all these interesting questions around, okay, we're so advanced in some ways, and yet are we smart about how we're bringing together analytics and human judgment? And maybe some of these biases that we've typically talked about in terms of cognition are now actually in the data and in the analytics themselves. That was sort of another flavor that I became really interested in. So at a high level, these were things that felt on the frontier for me as I think about decision-making under uncertainty in organizations. The NBA context, so this professional basketball. So for me, what I found really interesting about the NBA is, as opposed to baseball, where everybody like goes up one at a time, and it's very parsable, right? Like this person it's one pitcher, one batter, and they go against each other. In the NBA, 5 players are on the court at a time, and to generate opportunities to basically like bring value to their team in terms of how they perform, there's so much interdependence. The attributes of one player, their decision-making, affects the value that another player is able to do, right? One example being if one person's a really good shooter from far away, right, a good three-point shooter, that means that the defense needs to be closer to them. They can't give them as much room, which then gives room for the other players to operate on your team. So a three-point shooter, even without shooting the ball, even without receiving the ball, that skill now creates opportunities for others. But it's hard to, right? Like it's hard to understand that analytically because all these things are so interdependent. So I really like that aspect of professional basketball, which is like, okay, there's all this interdependence and we're trying to measure these things and there are a lot of statistics, but they're going to capture certain elements of this much more easily than other elements. And we know these teams are using all this human judgment. Scouts are everywhere. Also, so like, okay, how does this fit together? This feels like a very relatable challenge. So it's also very well documented. Whereas like, so the analytics are kind of readily visible from the outside in. And so I thought, man, this would be cool if I could get access, and through some connections, was able to get access to some NBA executives and we sort of did a series of discussions. Where we basically, the idea is to sort of share how we're thinking about these challenges with each other, me from my research in my field and from them and their organizations. These teams would have these conversations separately, anonymously, and they wouldn't know which other teams were also doing it. So it was an interesting experience.
Yeah, wow, that sounds really fun. I imagine you're an NBA fan.
I am, yes.
Yeah. Who's your team?
Well, so I grew up in Pittsburgh, but there's no NBA team in Pittsburgh. But I'm a University of Pittsburgh college basketball fan. But I had no NBA team. I always loved basketball. My high school was like a state champion, Shenley High School, which is no longer with us. Rest in peace. When I came up here, I started watching. I had my first child, and like there were lots of times where I was just like holding the baby with like couldn't really do anything, and I started just putting on the Celtics games every night. And so now I'm a Celtics fan, having watched them for, I guess, how long have I been here? Is it 14 years? Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now I'm a Celtics fan.
Wow, cool. Well, there's definitely worse teams to root for. Yeah, they're quite an impressive team these days. So when you met with these NBA teams, did you have a goal as far as like trying to help them make decisions about recruiting, about player scouting and things like that? What was sort of like the agreement between you two?
Yeah. So I think at a high level, what I was interested in and what was the premise for the conversation is how do they evaluate talent? So things like the draft. You have to choose which player to add to your team, and there's like, basically college players primarily. And you have some data, and you basically get an opportunity to add a player to your team through the draft. How should you figure out who is the right player to choose? Same with player evaluation to inform trades, free agent signings. So these are all basically the personnel decisions. And all of that comes down to how good do I think these players are going to be in the future based on what I know now. So there's inherent forecasting challenge there, in addition to other things you can imagine, like there's character issues, there's various things. But primarily, that's the lens. So I'm not interested at all in, should you foul the other team with 30 seconds left in the game or not? Like, I'm not interested in in-game decisions. I'm interested in how the organization thinks about allocating its resources to basically maximize the value, the quality of their team and their organization. So that then became so. We talked, there's like a get to know you factor, we're like all trying to feel each other out and understand each other's motivations. It's a funny business, and we can come back to some of the tensions that I've learned regarding that linger in the background in that field in general.
Well, I'm sure it's a little bit awkward to just start talking. Well, how do you pick your draft? How do you decide who to trade?
Yes, it was interesting because I at first very sort of cagey, and then by the end of we got to know each other pretty well. Now they're like naming specific players on who they were right or wrong about in a particular situation. But I think what was cool about this was the whole premise was for us to both learn from each other, right? I'm bringing stuff to the table, and I'm gonna try to get them to start thinking about things that I think my sense is, and of course based on what they're wrestling with, it will resonate with them or not. And so I think this is a natural thing that we should probably start thinking about as I'm thinking about decision making under uncertainty. And then they would say, well, we have thought about that, or we haven't really thought about that, and here's how we've been going about it, right? And then they would ask me questions. Okay, so how, right? Like, how would you think, like, what would be an example of trying to, build a strategy around this if we are able to avoid making this bias? But if there's another team that is falling into a particular trap, how might we exploit that, right? So they would then ask me. So it was kind of a nice, which I thought was a great premise for an exchange. It really became an exchange of ideas rather than, and it was very different from a lot of the things that I typically do And so anyway, yeah, that was kind of the premise and the flow of it.
Yeah, yeah. So I imagine teams have loads of data they can look at when they're evaluating a player, right? There's in-game data, right? I mean, points. There's assists. There's rebounds. There's blocks. There's all these sort of objective statistics, right? And then there's maybe the less objective statistics, like how much of a team player they are, or their ability to be a leader on the court, their ability to influence other players. How did you think about sort of like the universe of data that teams evaluate when they pick players?
Yeah, I mean, I let the teams lead on that front. I think one thing that's interesting and important is that they've gotten way better in the last 10 years in the types of data that they look at. So now they've got tracking systems that will follow where players are on the court. And so now they can do things like they can say when a given player took a shot, how far away were defenders from them, right? And so now you can look at how well are they shooting in wide open shots versus how well are they shooting when contested, things like that. They've advanced dramatically on the availability of this kind of data. And I think some teams are now very intentional about how they're using that and building strategies around it. And other teams, it's like you just dumped. It's like discovery and law. You've got the room full of files, and you're just like, oh, that's a lot. I'll use this, but I'm not exactly sure where I'm going to start. And so they're still figuring out how to apply it in an organized and consistent way, I would say.
Yeah.
But I let the team sort of lead a little bit on that side.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I imagine that could be a bit of a pitfall. If you have all this data, you think you know everything, but you really don't, right? I mean, because you have all this human judgment that has to go into it. Data is like garbage in, garbage out. You don't know if what it's telling you is really something reliable. And then that's, I think, gets to what you're doing is decision making under uncertainty. So is part of what you're helping them understand is, well, actually, you don't know as much as you think you know. That
sounds a little too condescending for me. Okay, I would say I was challenging them to ask difficult questions. Okay. And so let me give an example would be a lot of times they would use analytics for a specific question. They would say this player or this player, and they would say let's let's make an assessment or does this player have the potential to be a star? What does the data say? And I think one problem with this, and I think this is rampant in the NBA, some teams are better about it than others, is they go to this way of thinking once they're already thinking about specific cases, right? They're already, right? Let's say in any organization, someone's up for promotion, and now you're like, okay, this person's up for promotion, they're up for partner, should they get it or not? And now all of a sudden you're talking about their strengths and weaknesses, and all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, what do we value in this organization, right? What's our decision rule? But because now we have the case in front of us, everything we're talking about is really about that case, rather than, without thinking about specific cases, stepping back and establishing your decision rule and thinking through, okay, what are our organization's trade-offs around these things? How much are we willing to give on this dimension to get on that dimension? We should be thinking about those and establishing those in advance, separate from individual cases. And then we get there and we can apply that. And what I think happens a lot in a lot of organizations and a lot of these NBA teams is, or some of the ones that I spoke to, many of them, is they get to the specific case and now they're like, okay, let's basically create a decision rule to evaluate it once you're already there. And what ends up happening is you become very inconsistent in how you apply your logic. It's like every decision is informed by analytics and is seemingly very, reasoned and informed by data, but you're doing it in a different way for different players at different times of the year. And what ends up happening is they get massive motivated reasoning, confirmation bias. They end up having a specific case. they have a conclusion that they kind of want to come to. And because they didn't establish how they're going to use all this data to inform decisions in advance, they've got tons of degrees of freedom and they use it basically. And so it feels super objective, right? You're like, oh, it's, I can point to, but the fact is, if it was like, when it's a different player 4 months later, they take an objective approach, but use different kinds of data to measure X, Y, and Z to justify. So if you want to say, oh, so-and-so is actually a good defender, for example, what do you look at? Well, you can pick different ways of looking at, what's the opponent's shooting percentage when this person's within 3 feet of them, or, what's the other team's rate of scoring in general when this person's on the court versus off the court. There's actually a lot of different ways of thinking about that. They're all objective, but if you haven't decided in advance which ones you're going to use and how you think those are informative or not, those just become degrees of freedom to come to conclusions that you want to in the first place. So that was one thing that I was pushing on them and I would say that was somewhat emergent, right? That wasn't my intention going into it, but I think I would encourage them to talk more. And some of these teams are very good about this already, but many, I think, struggle with this, is think about this in advance of specific individual cases so that when you get there, you can be consistent in how you apply your decision rules.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. It sounds like that's the scientific approach, right? Having the same factors in play, right, when you're evaluating something.
Yeah. I think as a decision-making scholar, like you never want your decisions to be you want them to be informed and affected by the things that you want to be intentional about what you want those decisions to be based on. And what some of this other approach is like, you may be letting outside factors affect your decision because of that inconsistency in a way that if you zoom out and understood it, you would not want to happen. But because you didn't take the time to establish your process in advance, now all of a sudden, all these contextual factors, right? Like, to the point where it's like, oh, you're friends with this person's dad, right? And now you're looking at the data differently because of that. Or, they went to your alma mater. Like, that's a silly one, but it's actually kind of important. I think there's just lots of, there's a lot of, and I think that's why, you don't want your decision making and decision processes to be inconsistent across the same case, right? Like that would be a signal of, you could say, irrationality or something. So that's kind of important to me. And I think some of these organizations are blowing in the wind on some of these elements much more than you'd maybe think or would want.
Yeah.
Again, some of them are doing it really well.
Yeah.
But I think there's room to grow.
Yeah. Huh. I'm curious to hear about some other decision biases that you encountered with this work.
Yeah, I think one thing that one thing that I found really interesting is in the world of psychology, there's an idea like the fundamental attribution error, which is when you observe behavior, and you're trying to make causal attribution. What led to that behavior or performance? What led to that performance? There's a tendency to over-attribute it to the individual, like their personality, their individual ability, and under-account for the whole context that contributed to that. So one common consequence of this is you see someone you're at a meeting and then someone got upset about something that someone else said, and you're like, man, that person's just a hothead. And what you kind of you might not realize is you yourself in the same position, if someone interrupted you when you were proposing your idea, that makes you feel disrespected. Once you actually think about being in that position, you realize, oh, you might have also kind of blown up in that situation much more than you might think. So we tend to not realize how much us in those positions would kind of have done the same thing. But also it causes us to, for example, designate this person's a star because they did fantastic. Actually, they had the perfect setup, right? Everything was teed up to help them look like a star. That's a context that contributed to their success. So I like to refer to this as situation neglect. So the idea of under accounting for the situation. What I find fascinating about that is in psychology, we always talk about that in how we interact and observe and the causal conclusions that we come to as we think about that. But what I found really interesting is now the situation neglect is in the data itself, right? You look at, again, like someone's statistics and you think, oh, wow, this person is really, like, let's say, like, really inefficient. Like they're shooting poorly. They turn the ball over a lot. That's not a good sign. At the same time, you say, okay, well, what's the context in which this player was acting? Oh, they had to be the lead ball handler on this team because this team had no other, they had some, let's say, big guys or whatever, but they didn't have any point guards or something. So this player needed to be used in a role that's outside their their ideal role. And so they're forced to do these things that make them kind of look bad statistically. But if you were to get them, you would use them in their ideal role. And so in some sense, like, the context matters a ton there, right? But if you look at the numbers, it's not going to show you that context. So I thought that was super interesting to think about. Okay, we should, as we look at data, we should think about what are the contextual factors that the data can't see. And to me now, that's one of the first things I'm asking myself when I look at anything. Like, I think a lot of people are like, well, the data is the objective answer. It put out this, like, it's so smart. And I think the first thing I want to ask is, that's really interesting. Great. Let's understand, what is it picking up well and what is it not picking up well? Because that's now where the arbitrage opportunities are for improving beyond that.
Yeah. Wow. That's really important, I think, for all of us to remember, right? I mean, that attribute bias,
the fundamental attribution bias, I like to refer to it as situation neglect. I think it's like a little bit clearer.
Yeah. Have you, this might be a shot in the dark here, but have you seen that at all in the NBA? Just your own personal observation?
Which part?
The situation neglect, like.
Oh. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think teams are getting smarter about this. Like one example would be looking at, accounting for how many of this player's shots are at the end of the shot clock. Each time a team gets the ball, it's a possession. They get a certain number of seconds, and eventually, sometimes you're not able to generate a good scoring opportunity. Now all of a sudden it's down to 5 seconds, 4 seconds, and someone gets it. It's like, you just got to shoot it, right? Throw it up there because it has to hit the rim at least within that time frame. So there are some players who often take on that responsibility for their team of okay, now it's running out, give it to that person. They're just going to try to throw it up. And so, you want to adjust for the fact where in the shot clock are these, shots coming from, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's a good example of what you need to account for. It's what was the context in which the shot was taken? And I think this is one thing that's fascinating is, let's say you want to look at college data, so a college player's statistics, and you want to predict how good of a three-point shooter they're going to be in the NBA. It's super important these days. They finally figured out that 3 points is 50% more than 2 points. It only took them 40 years to figure out that math. So people are taking more three-pointers. So this is really, really important. It's a very important question. And so now you're trying to compare these different prospects. How good are they going to be as a three-point shooter in the NBA? And you might think, what I should do is I should look at their three-point percentage in college. Seems like a natural thing to do. Yeah. The issue is the context in which people are taking three-pointers in college are wildly different, right? Some players are getting way more space. Some players are having to take three-pointers with the shot clock winding down. Some are not, right? There's all these differences. And so it becomes a little bit unclear as to whether those are meaningful. And there's a fascinating thing, which is free throws. So this is when someone gets fouled, and you go to this particular line. It seems not like the rest of basketball, right? It's everyone stands around, and you get, say, usually 2 shots, and so you just stand there, bounce it 3 times, and shoot it.
Unpressured.
Unpressured, exactly. It's not like the rest of basketball, you'd think. What's fascinating is that they found that free throw percentage in college is just as, maybe more predictive of your potential to be a good three-point shooter in the NBA as college three-point percentage. Let me say that again. So you're trying to predict their NBA three-point percentage, and you can look at their college three-point percentage, and or you can look at their college free throw percentage. And the natural thing feels like you should look at their three-point percentage in college, but it turns out free throw percentage is quite predictive. And the reason, and I find this fascinating, is that you want to compare across people. How do you do that? Well, the free throw is the great equalizer. Everyone stands at the same line, the same distance. It's the same context, and so looking at it, so it's this nice, clean, situation neutral measure of shooting touch, and it turns out that that's super helpful for being able to predict three-point percentage. Even though in the spirit of the game itself, it feels completely different. So I love that as like I think we as managers, as decision makers, want to start thinking about what are these opportunities to compare our options or to evaluate talent, et cetera, where like context is neutral. And like either context is equivalent, or how can we find ways to account for that context? And these rare opportunities where you get truly apples to apples comparisons with like almost identical context, those are incredibly valuable. So I think that was an interesting one for thinking about situation neglect.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I would not have thought that. But it makes sense. I mean, if you have a high free throw percentage, I think that means that you're just a good shooter, right? Like you've just got good touch, and that must translate to anywhere around the court.
So, but if you've got a 85% free throw shooter who's only shooting 35% from 3-point, right? So very high free throw percentage and average 3-point percentage versus someone who has a 40%, so like say very strong 3-point percentage, but is only shooting like 65% from the free throw line. Which of those is going to be a better NBA 3-point shooter? It turns out a lot of times it's the high percentage free throw shooter who has a more average 3-point percentage in college. So again, it's like all of these. Some cases it's easy. Some cases you're like, wow, really? Like that? Yeah. You have to lean into it to truly embrace it, because you're right. Of course, higher free throw percentage is indicative of better shooting, but are you willing to go so far as to say that's more important than 3-point percentage? And some of it has to do with how often they're shooting and, again, other factors. But sorry to get too much into the weeds for some basketball things. But I think, again, like I love it as an analogy for how we think about identifying, like, what is value? How good is something really? How much value is a given individual or element of our organization? How much value are they actually generating? And how do we figure that out?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some other biases that you found. So we got situation neglect. Okay, well, let's go to the next one.
I think in terms of so I think one thing that I've alluded to a little bit is like the extent to which teams can fall in love with a particular player, and they then start doing massive amounts of confirmation bias. They basically find. So I think what a common and again, so the part of the premise is figuring out how are you using human judgment and analytics in conjunction, and a lot of times the human judgment was coming first, and identifying players of interest. And then basically like using analytics to refine that, but it became using analytics to justify, like, I found this player, I almost kind of want to get credit for scouting this player, and now I want to back it up with whatever statistics I can find. So this idea of sort of falling in love with particular players and that becoming really dangerous, I think, was one thing that emerged. I think probably the funniest one that I ran into that I just found this hilarious was all the teams I talked to. So there's an idea of availability bias. So this is kind of the idea that like we tend to overweight information that we can see easily relative to information that's more difficult for us to see. It's more memorable to us. It's more vivid. So one of the things I was asking them about is, right, like, one implication of that is how a player performs against you. Like these executives are all watching their team's games. They're watching all their own team's games. Well, you've got an opponent and you see how that player has performed against you. You saw that, right? And you're like, oh my God, like the Washington Wizards, beat my, let's just go with Boston Celtics because this random role player went, 5 for 6 from the 3-point line and whatever, had a big game. And you're like, oh, maybe, that person's really good. Now, you then can look at their aggregate statistics, which includes that game and lots of other games. And yet, the vividness, the fact that you experienced that, and you might see like, oh, actually, in general, they're not a good shooter. But because they had a very lucky shooting game against you and it was vivid and available and you saw it and you experienced the pain of it as they maybe beat you, right? Now all of a sudden that registers to a massive extent. And so I think a super common issue in the NBA is what I'm calling like the against us bias, which is like however a player performs against us massively affects how good we think they are in general. And like that, so I was asking them about this, like, what do you do? And they were all like, it's inevitable. Like, there's nothing, I couldn't, it was so funny because it's like, yeah, it's a problem, but like, we all do it. And we can't help it. Like, it's just, we're all watching our own games and like that. And the reason I asked them about it is like, I feel like I see it a lot, not just in the NBA, but it's again, like my experience with someone, as opposed to all the other measurements and evidence. It's like it ends up overshadowing that so much, and you see it across lots of domains and across lots of sports.
Oh, yeah.
Where you can just see it's like, oh, that team acquired that guy who did really well against them individually because they had a biased sample of
Yeah.
what that person could do. So what I found fascinating is they're all like, yeah, that happens for sure, right? Like, we're terrible about it. I think everyone else is terrible about it too. So like, what can you do? And my mind is saying, okay, what I would be doing is I would be tracking how each of my players performs against each other team. So I would know player X on my team on what are their statistics look like against each of the other teams, and who is likely to have a biased view of each of my players. Because what that will tell me is, okay, that team's probably overvaluing these players on my team and undervaluing these players on my team. That now gives me a sense of what kinds of opportunities there might be in trades, for example, for improving my team. So I like what I didn't quite get is I was surprised how often it was just, yeah, like it's a bias, we try to avoid it. I'm like, I think a smart team should be getting to the point of saying, yes, exactly, to saying, okay, let's assume we can avoid it. Let's assume everyone else does this bias. What's the strategy we can create? And like, let's at least look at that. Like, yeah. I couldn't, I just thought it was hilarious. Like, yeah, it's this naughty thing we all do.
Well, you're getting at like a competitive advantage there. I mean, like if everyone else is doing it, but you can do it differently, that's your competitive advantage, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I thought that was a funny one.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if there's data on this, but I feel like availability bias is happening to us all the time. I don't know if it's one of the more common biases we have, but I think about it a lot.
Yeah. In what sense?
Well, in politics or in like talking about like behavior of people we know, it's like you see someone who maybe was rude to someone else, and you say, oh, that guy's a real jerk, and I think that it just colors how you feel about someone just because you remember it just happened, and but you don't think about maybe the years you've known that person when they've been a really nice person.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really good one. One that I struggle with is in interactions with people. I'll sometimes find people who have been really nice to me, and then I hear from other people they've been a total jerk to them or worse.
Yeah.
Like we can get to things like, like sexual harassment or like maybe even domestic abuse or something like that. And that I've not observed this at Tuck, but just like in the, among friends and in the field, there'll be people who I hold in high regard who have been very nice to me, and then I like hear, from fairly vetted, I'm like, oh my God, and it's so interesting because I think we have this urge to want to defend people we like. Maybe it's a friend, right? Maybe it's a celebrity that you like, and you have this urge to come to their defense. But at the same time, like, I think the right way to think about this is like, it's like I've got one piece of information that's also might be informed by, I don't know, right? Like, I also need to take into account I'm a white male. I'm in a fairly prestige position, right? Like, people probably treat me differently than they treat other people, right? In other types of contexts. Again, like, taking that into account. And so, like, it's, you need to realize that, like, people being nice to you when you're in positions of power is not that informative. Whereas people being nice to people not in positions of power is actually incredibly informative about their character. And so I try to do a better job of thinking about like, my sample of information, my interactions with a person is one piece of the puzzle, but what percent of a person's life am I seeing? A pretty small percent, right? So that's a little glimpse, but there's a whole lot that I don't see. And there's a lot of research also that shows, like, we're so bad at identifying liars, for example. Like, people, like, I do research on overconfidence, and, like, one thing they found is people are incredibly overconfident in their ability to, like, identify lying and identify high character. We're awful at it. Like, people are so good at faking us into thinking they're honest and high character when they're not. So, like, I'm now, like, I try to take a Bayesian approach where, like, if you tell me like, 1 in 20, there's a base rate of, like, 1 in 20 accountants use fraudulent practices. Like, when I meet a person, even if they're nice to me, I'll just be like, all right, like, my base rate is that there's a 5% chance this person uses fraudulent practices. Like, there's no offense. It's just, like, my Bayesian prior as to, like, and they get, like, as opposed to what I think a lot of people do is they start that at 0. They seem like a nice person, so I think that there's a less than 1% chance they use fraudulent, and then they're shocked when actually, right? Like, that doesn't make sense to me, right? Like, we should be relying on those base rates a little bit more and updating our thinking from there.
I'm wondering if your work with the NBA has caused you to watch the game and follow the game differently. Do you pay more attention to certain things now? Are you looking at certain trades and saying, this was an obvious case against us or something?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one thing is, again, my view is very zoomed out in the sense that I'm interested in the personnel decisions and the strategies employed. So I would not say that doing this work has made me like on the edge of my seat for individual games. Like, oh my God, they hit the shot or didn't. And, like, it hasn't affected that, but it has affected my sense of how these teams are run. And honestly, I don't know how to say this without it sounding offensive, but, like, I actually was a little bit surprised the extent to which these organizations are, like, kind of the Wild West still. Like, they're incredibly advanced. There's really smart people in these organizations, and yet, like, the way they ultimately make decisions is a little willy-nilly. Like, like, there's often, like, 1 or 2 people who have, and if they're in a particular mood or they change mind about something, like, everyone else kind of has to, like, fall in sync. People don't want to dissent. And so, I think I've become a little bit, sensitive to some of those factors as well. Like, one that gets talked about is, like, when a new owner buys a team, they have this they have this incredible urge that they cannot hold back to, like, make changes to the team to stamp there, right? Imagine a new boss coming in, like a new manager in your organization, and they want to make it theirs, a new CEO. They're like, all right, I got to put my stamp on this. As opposed to taking the time to figuring out, like, what's working well, what's not working well. They want it to feel like it's theirs. And so there's been some examples in the last year of owners coming in, like, just making these massive changes to want to, like, really short-termism is the issue. It's like they want to look good in the short term. So they basically kill their organization going forward to try to look good in year one. And I think that's like, you can just see it. It's like the train crash. You're just like, oh my God, there's no way this ends well. I think another thing that I've started to notice quite a bit is like people being, so this is actually a good lesson with respect to how we use data and analytics is data. Let's ask ourselves, are they from the future or are they from the past? They're from the past.
Right, yeah.
We're trying to do well in the future. And so like we're using the data to predict the future. The problem is all our impressions are based on the past, and we need to be really smart about what does this information tell us about the future. And I think like one very like understanding the age curve for players, for example, like there's a natural trajectory of getting better to a particular age, and then you get worse, right? I'm now like, I'm on the worst side of the age curve, unless
you're LeBron James, maybe.
Well, right. But he's still getting worse. He's just still better than 99.9% of other players. But like, if you had to predict, is he going to be better or worse next year? You would predict worse, right? He's just like, you're past the prime year. He's amazing. It's not a criticism. It's just a reality. And so like one example that you see, so for example, one of the big issues, I don't know if I'm allowed to, I'll just like, so for example, if you look at like the moves that the Dallas Mavericks have made this in the recent years, you see them acquiring players and betting a lot on players who are post 30. Like you've got them signing Klay Thompson, you've got them relying on Kyrie Irving, who's after 30. You've got them trading their super mega star. I think he's like 25, like he's at the good part of the age curve for a player who's like 31 at the bad part of the age curve. And so like, and I think all these things are examples of like, you need to remember you're predicting where we're going, not where we've been. And so, I think it's easy to say, oh, we've got X, Y, and Z all-star. Well, they made an all-star team when? In the past. What you want to know is what's the chance they're going to make be good enough to make an all-star team in the future, and some of those players are not anymore. So I've also been surprised some of these teams are pretty I observe teams not accounting for like age curve and trajectory and using analytics in a which are inherently backwards, looking into the past and drawing the fixed conclusions from that as opposed to using those as projections.
Is that a form of bias itself? I mean, is there some sort of like prospect theory there, or is it like what's going on with like maybe overweighting past?
Yeah. I think it's probably a mix of things. I think there's probably a mix of things, right? Like it's available to us. I think there's also a sense of, maybe you've heard of the term like base rate neglect. So I've referred to base rates earlier and how I was thinking about like, I try to think like a Bayesian. I go in and like, I assume, I don't assume there's like, I don't assume this person that like, I don't say there's a 0% chance this person is like abusive to whoever, right? I think it's like whatever the base rate is, I start there.
Yeah.
And I think one of the issues with relying with data sometimes for individual players is underaccounting for base rates in general. And so part of what I'm saying is you need to account for what's the base rate in general for players reaching a particular age. And so like I would basically draw the age curve as a base rate. All right, this is what we can expect in general from a given player. In terms of trajectory. Now we can apply what we're seeing from them on top of that. And so I think it's good to use base rates as the starting point for a conversation. So likewise, and this is an issue for the falling in love with particular options. I'm happily married I met my wife when I was 21, so I'm quite anti falling in love despite that. But I think like one issue is you can get carried away because you're focused on the individual factors of a given player and under account for, okay, in general, a player who gets drafted in the 10th slot only becomes a star 8% of the time or something like that. Okay, so 8% should be the starting point for our conversation. I really like this player. So is it 20%? Like you need to anchor on the base rate to have your conversation about quality. And so I think understanding base rates, again, it goes back to where we were talking earlier. It's like you want to understand the starting point. You want to think about your decision rule in advance. You want to have and then map individuating factors onto that to update your thinking.
Yeah.
And so I think the age curve is an example of like kind of like neglecting that's kind of like base rate neglect.
Yeah. Okay. I think it would be interesting for our listeners to hear, especially alumni, about how you brought this NBA work into the MBA classroom. NBA, the MBA classroom.
I
right?
know it gets tough to talk about like MBA and NBA. So I taught a sprint class, which was like a new idea. I think it came out of our dean, senior associate dean of teaching and learning, Joe Hall. I believe it was originally his idea to have these 3-session classes on a kind of a niche, interesting, provocative topic that you wouldn't do a whole course on, but it's like a little blitz on something that might be a little offbeat or different. And so I did a sprint class called Avoiding and Exploiting Decision Bias in the NBA. And so we basically talked through some of the, some of these conversations I've been having with NBA teams. I've posed to the students to see what they could come up with. And then I basically said, okay, let's design, like, you need to now design a strategy. If this is a cognitive bias, and this might be what it looks like in, how would you exploit that? And then their kind of final assignment was to choose a different context and try to apply the logic that we're learning from the NBA. How could you turn that into identifying, opportunities in other contexts? And so that was fun. I mean, it was very interesting. We had a couple guests join via Zoom. Assistant general manager from the 76ers called in, and one of the lead consultants from Sportsology that does a lot of sort of support work. They also do executive search for a lot of these teams. So it was fun. It was interesting. It was neat to open up the topic as a little bit of a sandbox for the students to see. Like, I was curious to see what they could come up with, and I think it's good. I think it's good for students to have the opportunity to explore rather than always feel like the classroom is, I know things, you don't know them yet, I'm going to say them, and now you need to know them. There's some of that, right? And I do, but I almost want to be a influence on them in terms of how to think about problems. Not that they need to adopt it completely, but that they can add the Dan Feiler way of thinking into their repertoire of other ways of thinking that they've learned from other professors, and then apply that in a way that's creative and exploratory and helps them learn. So I think that's a fun way to engage with the subject.
Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting. I'm sure the students got a lot out of that. So just to review a little bit, if you wanted to kind of summarize for alumni or managers out there, what are some of the highlights of what you learned from your work with the NBA that people can apply in their organization and how they make decisions?
I would try to, I think one thing, again, like, I'm really interested in, we've got all these analytics, we've got all this data, and yet that is a lead into human judgment. And by the way, like, all these NBA teams have all this data. They also have scouts all around the world, and they have scouts reports on players. And like, there's all these elements of a player's quality that they rely on human judgment to measure, basically. And so I think what we want to do is think a little bit about how are we bringing these pieces together in a systematic, consistent, organized way to inform our decision making. And the data, let's assume for a second that the analytics are incomplete. The data are missing something. The way we're analyzing and looking at the data, it might be missing something from the picture. What is it that human judgment is picking up that the data can't yet? And so I think we should start doing more using human judgment to think hard about what they can pick up that the data are doing poorly, and then use that to inform, okay, what does that mean for what we should be trying to measure now? And now, okay, we should be trying to capture X, Y, and Z in what we're measuring, that then can be used as an input into our analytics. Or maybe can we get the human judgment to be captured objectively perhaps numerically, maybe you have 3 or 4 different people independently assess something, and that becomes data that can go into your analytics, right? And now the model is better informed and it's more accurate. And now you go back to the humans and say, okay, what next? Like what now what's the model missing, right? What's the next step? And more of like a cyclical figuring out what is it that humans are adding that the models can't, and then being intentional about what does that mean for what we should measure. I think that's just like a really, I think all organizations should start trying to be a lot more intentional about that process. The other just last thing I want to say that I learned is, holy crap, when people have job insecurity, it's like incredibly cognitively handicapping. I think one massive issue in the NBA is people are getting fired so much and everybody's so stressed about their jobs, where I'm sitting here being like, hey, like, let's talk about how to make these decisions as effectively as we can. And some of them are like ready to go there with me, but then a lot of them are like, half of my energy, they didn't want to say this, so they wouldn't say this explicitly, but this is my perception, is like a lot of their energy goes to trying to make sure that they've like aren't going to get the axe if things go badly. They want to make sure, and a lot of it's like networking. It's like, if I lose this job, can I get a job at another team? Like they want to stay in the bubble, and it's like it's so constantly like worrying about getting fired that the idea of like, let me establish a philosophy and principles of how to do this job well and execute on that. I think that the uncertainty around losing your job, I think, is really hindering some of these teams and organizations. So like, and the second you start feeling the pressure, you might do something like, oh, I'm like, if we don't start winning right now, I might get fired anyway. Let me trade everything, like all our assets that are valuable in 2-3 years. Let me trade those to see if we can Hail Mary it this year. And if it doesn't work out, I get fired anyway. Holy crap, that just kills. So like, I think the way owners put pressure on, I think they're called governors now, put pressure on those running the team is often, they don't realize like how detrimental that is. And I think in general, I would like organizations to, feels like I wish people were more focused on doing a good job. I know it sounds trivial, but like I feel like everybody's like, all that matters is networking now, right? Like, and it's like, you want to make sure you have good outside options and you want to make sure you're connected. It also helps to do your job really, really well, right?
Yeah.
Like that turns out that gives you a lot of leverage if you're really good at your job.
The fundamentals, right?
Yeah, like so. Like, can we start there maybe?
Yeah.
And so I think people don't realize like how damaging it can be when you put pressure on people to the point where they feel threat and start just worrying about cover your butt all the time, and constantly just always like they desperately want to stay in the NBA bubble, and they're constantly making sure their network's strong enough so that if they need another opportunity, they can have it. And I think that's actually really damaging.
Well, that probably speaks to decision making under stress, right?
Yeah.
Which is faulty usually, right? That people have found.
Yeah, I mean, like empirically, it's interesting because there's a version of stress which is like they're high stakes, and now you're really focused, right? Like incentives kind of create arousal, is how psychologists would talk about it, and like that could be focusing, and your effort is increased. But now what we're talking about is stress of a different kind. So like when you look at the literature, it looks more mixed because they're
different kinds of stress.
Yes, and different levels. But when it gets to like survival, now you get, right? Like you get, and I think what they don't realize is it gets people acting much more individualistically and less for the benefit of the organization. So I think there's a big time organizational culture issues in a lot of these teams. I think they're kind of aware of it. I think they're not quite sure what to do about it yet. And I think some of the teams are doing a better job of it than others, where they foster opportunities for disagreement. But I think some of the teams are like all the way up to the president of basketball operations are just like their job insecurity seems so high that like they don't have time to think about establishing a good culture. They don't have energy to focus on establishing good culture for those lower in the organization. They're just like, how do I like get through this next year or two to keep my job?
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of too bad. So, and what's interesting about that is like some of these conversations were really generative, and I think they were really wanted to learn and engage and wrestle with ideas. But those were the teams that tended to already, like the ones who were already doing better, in my opinion, were the ones that were most able to engage with some of the things that I was challenging them on. And some of the teams that are currently behind, who I think would actually benefit the most from the conversation, almost can't have it because they're so worried. You know, they're like in survival mode, and it's like, oh wait, we need to get X, Y, and Z in place before we're ready to even think about doing those things like more effectively.
Yeah.
So it also I hadn't thought about this in this way, but like you get to these places where organizations can get stuck, where I guess it's a form of like rich get richer, where like the people who are able to get success to a certain level, organizations, and stability to a certain level, are then the most able to like ask the next important questions, whereas the ones who are like fighting for survival in the first place don't have the bandwidth to even ask those questions, and that then causes them to be a step behind again.
Yeah.
So I think that was really, really interesting. And I think it makes it super cool, amazing people that I met. I think there can be a toxicity that comes with the amount of job insecurity that I would worry about for some of those folks.
Yeah.
But really, really interesting.
Yeah. No, this has been a fascinating conversation, Dan. Thanks so much for your time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we'll have to have you back again. Maybe talk about negotiations.
That
or
sounds good.
Something else.
That sounds good. Yeah. I'm happy to happy to talk. So.
Yeah. Thanks again.
Yeah, my pleasure. Fun hanging out with you. And hello to all any alums out there who maybe I've taught. Hope you enjoyed it.